All right. Thank you, Donna, for that very generous introduction once again, and for having me again, and for everyone who chose to kind of, you know, attend a heavy lecture, I guess, at a moment when you could be eating dinner or watching TV or something like that. So I always love the audiences at Charter Oak. I'm going to get my slide presentation here in just a second, but just a few words first on definitions. So a lot of the far right actors that I cover here, I can also consider fascist or kind of fascist adjacent. But since that's not always the case, I tend to use the phrase far right. Even though it's an inadequate kind of expression, it's kind of a placeholder. And also, when I use the word liberalism in this talk, I'm not using liberalism in the sense that most people in the United States use it, meaning kind of left to center, like Obama or Hillary Clinton. When I use liberalism in this book, I'm using it in the sense of Enlightenment liberalism, basically the notion of people as self-governing, rational agents with fundamental rights like free speech, freedom of association, etc. That's I'm kind of using liberalism in the broader kind of Enlightenment sense, of like rights and democracy and all that. I'm just going to get my presentation up here again. So I just might need to open this a second here. Let's see. Oops. Okay. All right. Can everyone see the slides? I can't see anyone, so you have to say, Donna, if you can just say voice-wise. Can you see the slides?
Your slides are not up.
Okay.
No.
Okay. All right. Let me get this up then. Okay. 1 second here. This is a strange new format. Okay, let's see. Okay. Huh. Yeah, this is a new version. Okay.
They were on the side before, just at the start of the program.
Okay, they should be up now. What about now?
Yes,
okay.
You got them.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so what I'm kind of trying to address here is evoked in this kind of Rolling Stone article is that the background of this talk is that a good chunk of the MAGA base is really angry right now at Trump over the bombing of Iran, and especially its younger and more radical core of the MAGA base. But even in the comment section on Breitbart, a website of the older MAGA base, they're viciously attacking each other over the Iran war, right? Sometimes in all caps. And there was a deep-seated expectation amongst at least some of MAGA folks that Trump would not get the country entangled in foreign wars. And so I'm hoping that this talk it's really kind of an outline of where that comes from. Why are so many people on the right naming themselves anti-war? And it's not new. A lot of them have been doing this for quite some time. And so the talk is more on the culture of the U.S. far-right base than it is some kind of solid forecast for where Trump is going to bomb next. Parties in power, left or right, tend to veer from the ideologies that animated them as movements, and they tend to disappoint their base as such. But I will say that there is a bit of predictive power in this talk, in the sense that we do have, if you kind of look at the background of the isolationist right, so to speak, there is some clues to how a far right state will wage war, either past or present. Now, so I'm gonna, like the meat of this to start with. So I've been to a number of Trump rallies that I go to for research. Went to one in Hartford, actually. He was at the convention center, and this was in 2016 when he was first starting. But I also went to his kickoff rally in 2023, which was in Waco, Texas. And I'm from Texas, and I'm visiting family in Austin. Waco's only about an hour away, and so I just kind of went down there. Um, and what kind of surprised me, it was a number of things, really. First of all, this is just an aside. When you go to these things, what? So Texas, this is in March, late March, and anybody who knows kind of Central Texas weather knows that it's already really hot in Texas in March, in late March. It was already kind of in the high 80s, right? And you're standing in line, the security line to get in, for hours, and there's no one set up any tarps, no one set up any kind of shade. You're just basically roasting. A couple of people actually had to be taken away in stretchers for heat strokes. Once you get past the security line, it was on the talk was in the Trump speech was on an like a airport tarmac, so there's also no shade, right? So it just, the obvious lesson here, they don't seem to care about their base very much. But nonetheless, but I'm not saying that because of I'm not introducing the talk because of that. It was mainly because while I was in this line, these three burly guys came up handing out flyers, and these burly guys were in all kind of desert camo. They looked military or ex-military. They were in combat fatigues. And they handed out this flyer that said, no more foreign wars, right? And they were from a group called the Patriot Front, right? And this is, this on just to focus on one paragraph of this, it says that unless those faithful to their nation and their future take action to end these fruitless wars, the best and brightest of the nation will continue to be cut down in the far corners of the world, absent any benefit to their families, communities, or the nation they left behind, right? And Trump's rambling speech that day kind of reflected the spirit of the flyer. Toward the very beginning, Trump said, "We've been the ones in this fight standing up to the globalists and standing up to the Marxists and the communists, standing up to the warmongers, the stupid warmongers and the neocons and the rhinos." And when somebody on that side says neocons, what they're really referring to is the kind of the pro-war right of the Bush years, the one that got us into kind of the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War. So this flyer that was handed out by these dudes was from the Patriot Front. And the Patriot Front, just to be clear, and this is the irony, is that it's a openly fascist organization that was founded in the suburbs of Dallas, Texas in 2017. And the Patriot Front preaches national unity on the basis of European racial stock and tries to create this race-based national community through boxing tournaments, all-male marches in uniform, and intimidation of those at LGBTQ plus events. Now, and this is their flag that I've shown in the second image. If those are familiar with this is the fasces. This is the symbol of fascism, this ancient Roman symbol that Mussolini resurrected and where fascism gets its name. So it's an American flag with the kind of the fasces in the middle of it. So they're consciously and knowingly a fascist organization, right? But the irony of this is that the fascist organizations are not supposed to do this. They're not supposed to talk about, they're not supposed to have an aversion to foreign wars, right? And because militarism was the beating heart of successful historical fascist movements of interwar Europe and Asia. And fascism was born of this convergence of events after World War I. And it was militaristic, not only because it made violence the center of its appeal, but also because fascists relentlessly oriented their home countries towards foreign war, right? And even before taking or reshaping state power, none of the movements around Hitler, Mussolini, nor the Japanese fascists ever coalesced around a slogan like "No more foreign wars." Yet, since the birth of fascism in the 1920s, U.S. fascist and fascist-adjacent currents have consistently espoused an isolationist politics in foreign affairs and this deep skepticism to military adventures abroad, right? And so that's the irony to me as somebody who studies fascism of this no more foreign wars claim, is that you have open fascists saying no more foreign wars, and fascists don't tend to do that, right? But this, I will say this, that this recurring skepticism towards foreign wars on the American far right should not be confused with genuine anti-imperialism or pacifism, nonviolence, nor even with any kind of categorical refusal to deploy U.S. forces overseas. Quite the opposite. And if I say isolationism in this talk, picture air quotes around that word at all times, right? Because they're not truly isolationist. Instead, the far right's isolationism reveals a view of America's place in the world that tells us volumes about the shapes and the potential directions of U.S. authoritarian violence at home and abroad. The far right impulse behind no more foreign wars frequently carries a very flexible definition of the foreign. And to make sense of when the right supports military action and when it doesn't, you have to look at how and where they imagine the foreign, and whether that image aligns with the U.S. foreign policy establishment at a particular moment. It often doesn't. So they will, if they say no more foreign wars, you have to ask, okay, well, what do you mean by foreign exactly, right? Virtually every major U.S. conflict since 1898 and Spanish-American War has been fought in significant manner under the banner of spreading freedom and democracy. And with this in mind, I argue that what the fascist adjacent right really rejects when it claims no more foreign wars is not military deployments per se, but democracy and human rights as a principle of global order. And I'll illustrate this in a minute. The right perennially returns and is most at home with this alternative rationale for military violence that you see more with people like Pete Hegseth, which is this contradictory of Carl Schmittian philosophy, settler colonial expansionism, and brute force in the defense of kind of race and people, right? And we can expect future foreign wars that the far right wages to be on those foundations. Now, in terms of like where I'm beginning, I'm going to kind of walk us through a number of examples from the 1940s of the quote unquote isolationist right. And it's kind of interesting when isolation comes to the fore on the far right and when it retreats, right? And so starting with the original quote unquote American isolationist of the America First Committee, I won't say the original because it really dates to the 1890s. But the American First Committee is the one that I'll spend the most time with here in this presentation. It was founded in September 1940 for the purposes of keeping the U.S. out of the Second World War. And at its peak, it had 800,000 members. And Charles Lindbergh was not its chairman, but Lindbergh was its most famous and most visible public speaker. And when writing about the American First Committee, and I'll just call it AFC from here on out, when writing about the AFC, I had to kind of first intervene in this historian's debate about the organization that was kind of annoying. And that is the case that, a lot of historians will say, oh, the AFC is recalled in public memory as a fascist organization, but not all, historians are comfortable calling it fascist or even right wing. And that discomfort's not without foundation. The AFC was founded by students at Yale University as a single-issue anti-war organization, and it initially brought together individuals from across the political spectrum, including some liberals and leftists like the socialist leader Norman Thompson and Sinclair Lewis, the author of It Can't Happen Here. So the original AFC did bring together people from from across the political spectrum. That's true. And when reading the literature of the AFC, there's rarely a whiff of fascism. It was a tightly disciplined organization that stayed relentlessly focused on this narrow message of keeping the U.S. out of the emerging war and lobbying to stop legislation like the Lend-Lease bill or the annulment of the Neutrality Acts. I'm showing this slide because this is kind of typical of their arguments. Their arguments were usually more along the lines of, Hitler can never really invade America, right? So like if you can't even really, this is 1940, if you can't even cross the English Channel to get England, how is he going to come across the Atlantic? Which is not incorrect, but also just kind of beside the point, right? but so their literature did not have really a real whiff of fascism, and its spokespeople never argued for fascism as a positive good, but focused on arguments more like this, like Hitler can never really hurt us. But unfortunately, too many well-intentioned historians have looked at their materials and taken them at their word. That is, that too many historians have concluded, looking at articles like this, that they weren't really fascist or even right-wing. But fortunately, there's people like this guy, Avedis Darunian, who was a researcher. He was Armenian American, and he went undercover to study and to kind of crash the meetings of all of these far-right organizations. He crashed the meeting of virtually every far-right organization in the tri-state area. He was based in New York City, but he also he came up a lot to Boston, into New England as well. But again, he went undercover and researched all these far-right groups, went to their meetings, all of this stuff, right? And what's kind of interesting, and this is, and he left all of his materials in this National Association for Armenian Studies and Research in Belmont, Mass, which I've been to many times. And when he would crash the AFC meetings, it was interesting what he found, right? And this is I'm quoting from him. This is from an unpublished report that's been just kind of sitting in the archives since the 1940s. He writes, frankly, when he went to a Madison Square Garden rally in April 1941, where the AFC was and where Lindbergh was speaking, he observed the crowd. He noticed faces in the crowd. And he said, frankly, I had not been as convinced that America First was fascist. The meeting tonight made up my mind about them. Many of the people there were violently anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic cries interrupted the speakers. There was asked who wants war. They yelled Jews. He recognized faces in the crowd from all of these other organizations that he had crashed, including Father Coughlin's Christian Front, which was the largest and most notorious anti-Semitic pro-fascist organization of the 30s, but also the German-American Bund. He saw all of these people circulating in the crowd. He saw Coughlin's anti-Semitic social justice magazine sold outside the auditorium. And he concluded that the committee is rapidly becoming an out-and-out Nazi transmission belt is obvious to any who have observed it at close range. So historians have never, they just look at these materials and go, okay, well, they weren't really necessarily even right-wing. But when you see like the actual kind of, the exposés of them, or people kind of reporting on them, or people actually going to their meetings, you get a very different story that it's not captured in the literature, right? So just going to go to this too. I'll say a little bit more too about this phrase "America First." Because unfortunately, there has been some scholarship on this point. There's a good book on this by the origins of this phrase by this author, historian Sarah Churchwell, but also others have done kind of smaller article-length studies on this. But when the America First Committee chose America First as its slogan, it was already choosing a retro slogan in 1940 with deep nativist connotations, right? So I'll just sit on that point for a second. When Lindbergh and them used the word America First for the America First Committee in 1940, this isolationist slogan, it was already retro and already familiar in 1940, right? And the phrase first appears in a newspaper article in 1884 on tariffs, and America First is used in the presidential campaigns of Woodrow Wilson, Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, also frequently used by the Second Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s that was a mass organization. And the phrase was typically evoked around three seemingly incongruous areas. So America First as a slogan tied together this idea that we need to erect higher tariff walls, we need to stay out of foreign wars, and we need to attack hyphenated Americans, right? And so America First brought together these three different things. Now, hyphenated Americans, what does this mean? So in the 1890s to the 1920s, the U.S. saw the largest immigration wave in U.S. history as a percentage of population. A lot of these immigrants were from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, and also on the west coast of Japan. So all manner of Eastern European like immigration, and also a lot of Italians are coming in at this time. And right around the early 20th century, people start using hyphenated names. They start calling themselves Italian American or Jewish American or Japanese American. And so the origins of America First was nativists responding to that and saying, no, you are not, like, you shouldn't say you're Japanese American or Polish American. You should just say American. A real American puts America first. It doesn't use the hide behind the hyphen. That's where America First comes from. So it always, from the very beginning, had this mix of attack on, it was this nativist attack on immigrant identity. It was about staying out of foreign wars, and it was about erecting tariff walls all at the same time. And it was always a double register to its use. It was always a statement on national identity within U.S. borders and a statement of the proper place of the U.S. in the world. Right. So I'm going into this, really to kind of show that America First, as an isolationist statement, always tied isolationism to a kind of nativism, from the very beginning. Now, something about Charles Lindbergh before and after, and this is, like I said, America First is the committee is most of this talk. So I'm going into detail here. But so his speeches, when before and after 1940 are interesting. So he joins the America First Committee in 1940 when it's founded, but his tone and his language he uses is very different after joining the America First Committee than before, right? So this is a later one. This is what he sounded like as an America First speaker. He would say, an independent American destiny means, on the one hand, that our soldiers will not have to fight everybody in the world who prefers some other system of life to our own. On the other hand, it means that we will fight anybody and everybody who attempts to interfere with our hemisphere, and that we will do so with all the resources of our nation. Now, this is the Charles Lindbergh, and typical of his anti-war arguments as a member of America First, right? And on the face of it, a lot of this seems pretty innocuous, until you consider the full context of it and when it becomes not so innocuous. So this is what he sounded like before he joined America First. And this is in an essay he published in Reader's Digest in 1939. He wrote, "We, the heirs of European culture, are on the verge of a disastrous war, a war within our own family of nations, a war which will reduce the strength and destroy the treasures of the white race, a war which may even lead to the end of our civilization. And while we stand poised for battle, Oriental guns are turning westward, Asia presses towards us on the Russian border, all foreign races stir restlessly. It is time to turn from our quarrels and to build our white ramparts again. This alliance with foreign races means nothing but death to us. It is our turn to guard our heritage from the Mongol, Persian, and more before we become engulfed in a foreign sea." Okay, so when he became a speaker for American First, he never stopped being that guy in the second quote, right? I'm going in reverse order, and it's very revealing. So what I'm basically why I'm kind of going into this is that in that first quote here, you probably can see my pointer, hopefully, there are two flip sides in this of a kind of a global imaginary that have been perennially repeated in the far right ever since. And that the first one is this one, that our soldiers will not have to fight, everybody in the world who prefers some system of life to ours. That, on the face of it, sounds innocuous. It's a nod to kind of liberal tolerance and pluralism, but it assumes its full meaning in the context of these other statements, particularly even in this one, and that we will fight anybody who attempts to interfere with our hemisphere, right? So that is a reference to the Monroe Doctrine put forth by President James Monroe in 1823. And so when Lindbergh evoked the Monroe Doctrine in the context of his overall fascist worldview, he's imagining the U.S. as a spatially contiguous empire, a spatially connected empire, but one that coexists with others who are free to pursue their own autonomous political orders within their own territories and their own kind of imperial zones. Now, in the full context of his ideology, which again is repeated on the far right ever since, this preferring some other system of life to ours is not really as innocuous as it sounds like. It's not so much liberal tolerance as the rejection of a shared sense of humanity, and that brings us to Carl Schmitt. And just as Dorothy Thompson, who was a journalist at the time, kind of pegged quite rightly Charles Lindbergh with this quote. She said in February 1941, American fascism, while preaching isolation from Europe, is designing a program of American imperialism, which is a copy of Hitler's continental imperialism. The outlines of it are most clearly discernible in the speeches of Colonel Charles Lindbergh. It consists of giving Europe to Hitler and Asia to Japan and Russia in return for a new Monroe Doctrine. We are to be the master folk of the Western Hemisphere. She very much nailed it in 1941. That this idea that what he's really not about just liberal tolerance and pluralism, about just other ways of life. It's about, like, we get to have Latin America, Hitler gets to have his territory, Japan gets to have its territory, etc. Now that idea comes from Carl Schmitt and his idea of Großraum, which is big space in German. Now Carl Schmitt was a legal philosopher. Lived a very long time from 1888 to 1985. And he formulated this idea of Großraum from 1939 to 1941. Schmitt, I should say, was a Nazi Party member and refused to kind of renounce the Nazi Party after World War II, even when it was politically, advisable to do so. So he was a Nazi Party member and he was a believer. And his notion of Großraum was briefly used by the Nazis to justify expansion in the East. And by the way, I'm using this. Oh yeah, I'll just keep going. In recent decades, this idea of Großraum has been directly accessed by the German far right. His notion of Großraum has had a comeback on the German far right, particularly this concept of AfD, and particularly right after Trump started talking about Greenland and going into Greenland and going into Canada and taking the Panama Canal Zone. He was basically, like, people in Germany were saying, "Oh, that's Großraum. We recognize that. That's Carl Schmitt." I just said that part. But what's kind of chilling is that Schmitt's ideas are now advanced by the American post-liberal intellectuals like Peter Thiel, Eric Posner, Adrian Vermeulen, Gladden Papin, and also obliquely even by J.D. Vance, right? J.D. Vance has read Carl Schmitt, right? And even though he denies that he is putting out a Schmittian worldview, he is, right? So these ideas that I'm talking about, Schmitt, and this idea of Großraum, which I'm going to go into, it's not just confined to the 30s and the Nazis. American right-wingers are starting to really glom onto this too. Now, what is the idea of Großraum? Großraum is a political space in which a coherent unitary idea radiates throughout its entire territory. One idea that's shared by a people awake to its national identity. It has a Reich at its center and excludes all foreign intrusions from spatially alien powers. Now that's a mouthful. So what a Großraum is basically, it's got a core, a homeland, an imperial homeland, a Reich, and he insisted on the untranslatability of this word. And then it kind of radiates its power into its broader territory. But an ideal Reich is an ethnically homogeneous folk with clusters of ethnically homogeneous peoples in its protected big state. So what this would look like to Schmitt, and this is the ideal, briefly a Nazi ideal, was that a Großraum it has the Reich at the center, and then it has a galaxy of ethno-states kind of around it. So a Poland just for the Poles, a Ukraine just for the Ukrainians, a Hungary just for the Hungarians, etc. And all are kind of run on the same, ethno-states, anti-Semitic principles, but they have their own territories within the broader umbrella of the Third Reich, right? So this was the idea of Großraum, and and it's, what was interesting though is that Schmitt said that the ideal for a Großraum is also the Monroe Doctrine. He saw that as the principle. So substitute for what I just said for with the Reich now is like the United States, and it's radiating its power into Latin America, and all these Latin American states are run on similar principles as the U.S., but the U.S. is ultimately in charge of the show. But the important thing here is that it's there's non-interference. Each Großraum is fully sovereign. It won't, their Reich won't interfere with the American Reich on the Monroe Doctrine, and vice versa, and other powers wouldn't appear for this. And the important point is that it's supposed to be spatially coherent. It's all spatially connected. It's the anti-model is like the British Empire, the French Empire, which he said is just like real estate scattered across the globe. It's spatially incoherent. Now, also Schmitt is important because he is, again, like I mentioned this before, he's really circulating quite a lot on the, the European far right. Americans are starting to read him. You can get even like in Germany, in Austria, you can get even your Carl Schmitt laptop stickers like this that they sell. And he says this, infamous phrase from him: whoever says humanity wants to cheat, or sometimes translated as wants to swindle. And why I'm going, and I mentioned this, I'm showing this slide not just to show the popularity of Schmitt, but that quote is important for what I've just said, going back to Lindbergh, right? Because for Schmitt, what does he mean when he says whoever says humanity wants to cheat? The idea behind that is that any politics that's based on spreading democracy or human rights or a sham. It's a mask for a moneyed interest which forms the truly tyrannical and homogenizing force, right? And so the interesting thing is that he's not entirely wrong about that. Those who can remember Vietnam War protests would often say, oh yeah, obviously this idea of spreading democracy is a sham, right? And so Schmitt even gets some people on the left with this. Some academics on the left have also read Schmitt and kind of like what he says, mainly because of things like this, because he pokes hole in this idea of the hypocrisy of a war for democracy, which, yes, has been abused throughout U.S. history. We get that. But you don't need Schmitt to make that point. But Schmitt's broader point is this, behind that quote, is that liberals are the totalizers, not us. We don't want to have anything to do with people in other regions at all, because Europeans are foundationally and essentially different people, right? And by the way, this idea of Großraum has an expression in Europe. This Russian philosopher Alexander Dugin formulated into this theory called Eurasianism. That's where at the center would be this, Russian homeland, like run by warrior monks as a theocracy, and it would spread out into territory, usually like in the former Soviet Empire. And Dugin was very close to Putin for a while. He was even called Putin's Rasputin because of his beard before he was thrust out of power. By the way, the Ukrainians tried to assassinate Dugin, and they put off a car bomb, blew up a car bomb, but they got his daughter instead. But so Dugin also is tied into this whole Schmittian geography thing, right? Now, fascist war in practice, and this is important, I think, for the remainder of what I'm going to say, is that in practice, even though the Nazis or Schmitt put out this idea of Großraum, right, where all these ethno-states and under the German Reich get to do their own thing. The case of Ukrainian nationalists is interesting because there was some Ukrainian nationalists like before and after the German invasion in 1941 of the Soviet Union, where some of these Ukrainian nationalists were anticipating joyfully a German occupation, because they thought that, and they were into this idea of Großraum as well, because they thought, okay, well, we'll have our Ukrainian kind of nation state and it'll be protected, it'll be not Soviet, and so these were dissidents within the Soviet Union in their own right. but they started to anticipate this being part of the German Reich as a little ethno-state by starting to form kind of militias that would hunt down Jews and murder Jews, which is a long bad history of this in the Russian Empire. But what was interesting is that the Nazi war in the East was more directed by Lebensraum, which is living space, than Grossraum. In other words, the Nazis, rather than just let the Ukrainians have their little ethno-states, just bulldozed over them, right? And just the idea was to replace all of Ukrainians in particular with German farmers eventually, and exterminate all Ukrainians and just have ethnic Germans colonize their land and thus expand the folk. So even in practice, the Nazi idea of Grossraum was a scam, and it was really they were really more settler colonial than anything else. Now, just kind of going forward here is that, interestingly enough, during the Cold War, so before World War II and during the war, there was an isolationist hard right, and we returned to that since the 1990s quite a lot. But in the interim, really, between 1945 and 1990, really, there was a real decline of isolationism on the hard right. And I would say, there's a kind of an obvious reason for this, is that, during the Cold War, the far right shared the same basic enemy with the U.S. foreign policy establishment. That's communism. And thus the far right was no longer misaligned with the U.S. global order in any kind of fundamental way. But their image of the communist was often at odds with the Cold War liberal consensus. And after the fall of Joe McCarthy in 1954, the right's particular brand of anti-communism took on this kind of rebellious, insurgent qualities. Organizations in this period on the right, like the John Birch Society, repeatedly attacked the JFK and LBJ administrations for where and how they waged their wars on communism. But they didn't reject the fundamental premise of a communist enemy to be fought anywhere in the world. For Cold War liberals like the Americans for Democratic Action, the JFK and LBJ administrations, communism tended to be something over there, right, in Laos or Bolivia, the Soviet Union, China. But with right-wing anti-communism, there was a collapsing of the foreign and the domestic. The communism wasn't just over there, but everywhere. The communist was in the civil rights movements, it was in labor unions, it was in Social Security, it was in all of those things I just mentioned, civil rights, labor militancy, Social Security, were seen by the far right as literally directed from Moscow or Peking. And so this is how their anti-communism differed from, say, JFK's. So to oppose civil rights in Alabama for the far right was to take a swipe at Soviet power, right? Because it's to take to wage war in Vietnam or Korea was to crush the civil rights movement at its very source, because Korea, Vietnam, China, the Soviet Union, they're sending out all of these kind of leftist tendrils into the United States too. So it's like killing the source of the octopus. For this reason, what's interesting is Pat Buchanan, in his book, 1999 book, Not a Republic, an Empire, he quoted John Quincy Adams that the U.S. shouldn't go abroad in search of monsters to destroy, and in the next breath, and with no contradiction in his own head, could say that the U.S. war in Vietnam was a legitimate and necessary thing, right? Now, this is one of my last slides. After the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, key figures of the far right began to default, and consciously so, back to a Lindbergh view of American power. And this shift was at the heart of the paleoconservative movement of the early 90s, which revolved around Pat Buchanan as its most public face. And its anti-imperialism was connected to this exaltation of the U.S. as a kind of settler colonial project. And just a quote from Buchanan's book, Republic Not an Empire, The annexation of Texas, the Southwest, California was manifest destiny, not imperialism. These lands were contiguous, largely empty, easily defendable with a small army, and involved no entanglement with the great powers of Europe. Imperialism is the rule of other peoples against their will, and most Americans recoiled at the idea of colonizing Mexico or making Mexicans a subject people. So he's defining imperialism very narrowly, which is typical on the far right, of like what the British did or the French did or what the United States did in the, like within the Philippines, of you have a literal colony and you rule another people from afar. But what the right has been far more interested in is settler colonialism, about like taking someone's land and farming it yourself. So Buchanan historically sees no problem with manifest destiny or no problem with kind of destroying indigenous peoples, but he does have a problem with like ruling other people from afar, because that brings racial contamination in a way that just replacing them does not. And I like, I'll skip past that quote for time, but this is kind of typical, this embrace of like settler colonialism. It was also part of the Patriot Front, and they had this other kind of common meme, not stolen, conquered. So they're really into the idea of the settler history of the United States, and they're fine with kind of taking this spatially continuous empire that you kind of settle yourselves, but they're not kind of cool necessarily with bombing Iran or something like this, right? And that's so when, to kind of sum up here, when Trump started talking about like taking over Greenland or taking over Canada even, or taking over the Panama Canal Zone, most people in the world and even in the United States, that just sounded insane. But if you're immersed in this stuff, it makes sense, right? Because that's spatially continuous. It's right next door. You're just expanding your territory and you're replacing those peoples. You're not so much kind of like trying to wage some war for democracy or human rights or anything like this, right? And that goes back to Lindbergh, that goes back to Carl Schmitt, that goes back to the Cold War, etc. And so just to sum up here, and to leave some time for questions, of course, the far right's isolationism, it's not really nonviolent or anti-militarist or even opposed to military deployments outside the U.S. It's not isolationist. It often registers a misalignment between the far right and the dominant U.S. foreign policy establishment, like in the Cold War or during World War II. It's really a rejection of democracy and human rights as the basis of global order, partly because it rejects the notion of common humanity. And also for the far right, they're far more interested in spatially continuous empires or settler colonialism as acceptable modes. And also they tend to kind of collapse the foreign and the domestic. And because they do that, they really won't rule out violence anywhere in the world, right? And just a last kind of statement here, what the far right, what the isolationist right is far more interested in is war as this domestic thing. And you've probably seen this symbol. It's from Marvel's The Punisher. It's on a lot of pickup trucks, and it's basically from the comic book character, the Punisher, that's been around since the 1970s. And the Punisher was somebody whose whole family was murdered, and then he basically, after serving in Afghanistan, or in the earlier case in Vietnam, and he comes back and he really declares war on criminals within the United States. So why they're drawn to this symbol, and why violence on the far right with MAGA tends to kind of coalesce around this symbol, the skull with the 4 teeth, that's because the kind of violence they're far more interested in is the violence that you have at home, right? The violence that's kind of that's right in your own backyard. That's what animates them the most. But that said, they will not rule out violence anywhere. On the flip side, try to kind of end on somewhat of a happy note. Although this is fairly dark, they're not doing very well right now, and they're not also kind of they've clearly have not convinced most people around this project, the particular vision of violence, right? But that said, if there is kind of a future state that's, run by the likes of J.D. Vance or Hegseth, you're going to see kind of foreign policy and war and all these things. You're going to still see those things, but you're just going to see them waged on a very different logic than wars for democracy or human rights. So that's that. Thank you.
Well, thanks for attempting to end